In today's video, we're going to go over these generic Chinese yellow router bit kits. I think when most people first get a router, myself included, we want a lot of options with what we do with it, but we don't really know a ton about what each one does, what we're going to use, whether we should spend money on it. So we buy one of these kits. I think the 15-bit is really common. It's usually at a good price, $20 to $50, depending upon the time of the year. But I want to walk through and show you what each of these bits does and looks like so you have a good idea of whether this kit is right for you, whether it doesn't include some things you want, or whether it's too much. And for anyone who wants to skip this whole video and just know my final thoughts, I give these kits a 10 out of 10 for what they offer, what the purpose is, and the cost. For a starter kit, these are 10 out of 10. They do what they're supposed to do. As you can see, I still have all of these after years, and most of them still work fine, as you'll see in this video. So great purchase for me at the price. I don't think you need a ton more, but I would get the 15 as a minimum to give you a bunch of options. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to be doing almost all of these on the router table, just because it's easier setup time-wise to go through each bit, but it makes no functional difference. I've used almost all of these handheld. I don't think I've ever used this Cove Bit handheld, but the rest of them I'm pretty sure I have. Maybe not these two slot bits either. But we're going to do it on the router table just to save myself time, and I hope that's okay. The first ones we're going to start with are all of the edge profiles, as I know those are the most interesting to a lot of people, and some of the other ones are pretty straightforward. So we'll go through the edge profiles first, and then later in the video we'll cover the slots, the dovetail, the flush and template, and whatnot. All of this is going to be done on just 3/4 pine, so a common thickness and a common wood for a lot of people starting out. And I'm going to go around and I'm going to do the side, the end grain, and the edge grain of both so you can get an idea of what it looks like wrapping around a corner, what it looks like on each side of the grain. But I often find it's very important to actually see what it looks like because it's kind of hard looking at these little pictures to get an exact idea of on the end of your table, on the side of a box, what is it going to look like when it wraps around the grain, what's it going to look like on the end grain, etc. The first two profiles we're going to start with are the Cove Bits, the 1/4 inch and the 1/2 inch. And one thing to remember when shopping around for router bits is that you are going to be left with the opposite of whatever shape the bit is. The knives are going to remove material. So this is not going to get you a round edge. It's going to get the exact opposite. It's going to cut out a coved rounded edge in the opposite direction of a roundover bit. So just keep that in mind when you're at Home Depot or at any store looking at a router bit. It's going to cut out the exact opposite of what the shape is. Now, one thing I want to point out before we start the edge profiles is that whether you're doing it with a router table or handheld, you do not have to take the entire cut at once. And in fact, you often shouldn't. You can do this in multiple passes by raising and lowering on your plunge router or on your router table. It's much easier on the router to take it in multiple passes. And then sometimes in the case of these big beefy ones, it's almost essential because it becomes very hard to hold on to this wood because the amount of force and the RPMs at the tip of this are incredibly high. Now, your router will come with directions as well as your router bits sometimes on the RPMs to use with different size bits. For the most part, the bigger it is, you want to slow it down a bit, especially when you get to these big guys. So we're going to take this in 2 or 3 passes. This is the 1/4 inch Cove Bit. I'll also note that you don't have to use the entire profile size. If you just want a tiny little cove, you can move your fence back and forth as well to align it so that you're taking out the curve, the top of the cove right at the edge or wherever you want. A router table allows for a lot of playing with that, whereas a plunge router, not so much. And there is the 1/4 inch Cove Bit to full height. Got a little burning, a little tear out, but not too bad. And hopefully that gives you a good idea of what you're looking at when you use the 1/4 inch Cove Bit. The next bit we're going to cover is the 1/2 inch Cove Bit. In no way, shape, or form should you attempt to take this in a single pass, in my opinion. This is a very beefy bit. I'm going to slow the router down for this from the 6. We're going to go down to the 5. We're going to see how that feels. If we're getting chatter, if we're getting just a way too much burning, we'll go down a little more, but we're gonna start by going down to the 5 on the Bosch router. I don't know if that's 20,000, 18, I'm not sure exactly what that is, but the second from the highest is where we're gonna start. And there is your full depth 1/2 inch Cove Bit. You can see a much deeper, steeper cut than the last one. For reference, there's the 1/4 inch and there is the 1/2 inch. Now, this is what I consider to be the full cut, is to where the top of the wood is just still on the bearing. You can go higher and leave, it's hard to describe, but it leaves a slightly different little rim around the top here. And it can remove more of this the higher you go, but I don't really suggest that. I like having the bearing there as backup so that if you tilt into it, you're not going to send your piece flying at all. But there's the 1/2 inch Cove Bit and the 1/4 inch Cove Bit. Next up on our list are going to be the 1/2 inch and the 1/4 inch roundover, another very common edge profile for tables and a lot of other things. Okay, there is our 1/4 inch roundover. You can see relatively slight, but this is not a chamfer bit. It's enough of a roundover to remove noticeable amounts of material, not just soften the edge, but a very common bit, and it looks pretty good on a lot of different things. And now we've got the 1/2 inch roundover, another large bit that I would suggest taking in 2-3 passes. And there is our 1/2 inch roundover. As you can see, a much larger roundover. For reference, there's our 1/4 inch again, and then the beefier 1/2 inch roundover. All right, next up, we have the 15-degree chamfer bit and the 45-degree bevel bit. These aren't really used for the same things, but I'm just going to put them back to back because they both have a straight line angle. This is more for breaking edges, and it gives you a lot of room based on how deep you want to go to put a very light break on a thin piece of wood or a much larger, longer break, still the same angle, on a thicker piece of wood. So this is definitely one to play around with the height, and this as well. You can either remove a ton or just a little at a 45-degree angle. Okay, we're starting with the 15-degree chamfer. Both of these can be utilized to put very small bevels on things or very large bevels in the case of the 45-degree bit. Okay, here's the light pass with the 15-degree chamfer bit. As you can see, it is very gentle, but this is just for breaking an edge. It'd be similar to taking a pass or two with a block plane. You don't really have much noticeable from the top. You can't really see it, but the edge is no longer pointy and sharp. So it can be used in that case if you don't want it to look like there's a big edge profile, but you don't want to leave a sharp edge. And this will be the full pass, full height of the 15-degree chamfer bit. And this is the full pass of the 15-degree chamfer bit. You can see still very subtle, just a slight angle on there. From the top on the camera, you almost can't notice it, but you can see right here where we're coming around. A really subtle, good way to just soften an edge and just put a little bit of detail onto your piece. We are now going to do the 45-degree chamfer, and I'm going to show you a relatively low pass and then a full pass, because this is another bit where you can do a lot with different heights, and it will vastly, drastically change what your piece looks like. This is really good also for double edge profiles, for something a little underneath the board and then something on top on tables. So we'll take the smaller pass first. And by smaller pass, I mean the height, how high the bit is raised when this is still flush to the fence. And as you can see here, this is the relatively shallow pass. Still a very nice angle, but not a whole lot taken off. It's a good look. if you don't want to go too drastic. All right, we'll take the deeper pass now. Okay, there is the full depth. I think I went a little past it as we've created a little lip on the edge here, but we're within a 30-second or so. So a very drastic cut. On a 3/4 inch piece of wood, you've got probably about a 1/4 inch left at the bottom there. So 45, and then this is back to the 15, which is probably barely noticeable compared to the 45. All right, those are the two angled bits, and we'll move on to the next. Next up, we have the Roman OG bit, or which I for years called the Ogre, thinking there was an R in there. And this is one of those bits that everybody who gets a kit and discovers edge profiles and routers, this is the fancy one, right? And you want to just go all in. And it's a great looking bit. It's a classic. There's a reason it comes in almost every beginner set. But don't be too lulled into thinking that more complex is always better. Always think about what's right for your project. So we're going to go through, we'll just do this one. You can get a good look at it. And this is what a full depth of cut profile of the Roman OG bit looks like. We have a nice cove mixed with the roundover and then still a nice straight edge on there. It's a classic bit. It's a great bit. The next bits we're going to go into are the 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch slot cutting bits. These can cut slots and grooves of different depths and thicknesses into the edge of a board or in the face if you're using a router table and can stand the board up. Now these have different purposes, oftentimes used for rabbets, for people who don't want to use your table saw, as these will give a perfectly flat cut. So we're going to go through and show you what both of these look like. Now one of the limitations of the slot cutting bit is the height that you can go up. Most router bits in these kits have a line on them that designates how far down the shank needs to be within the collet. Therefore, you can't get this cutter higher up to allow you to get more depth higher up on the router table. So you are limited by the height that you can go up, as well as being limited by the depth that you can go from the collet if the collet is at all above the table. If it's below the table, you can go the full depth to the bearing, of course. We're going to start out by making a rabbet where part of this bit will be under the table, and then we'll move up to a slot on the edge and then on the face. Now, one thing you'll notice about the slot cutting bits is part of the depth can be determined by how far out you have the fence. If you have it all the way back to the bearing, you're going to take the full cut every time. So instead of up or down, you're playing with the fence now as to how much you want to expose. I don't normally take these in a single pass. The 1/4 inch you can do usually, the 1/2 inch definitely not. So we'll start out with a small pass and then we'll go to full depth of a rabbet and then we will do the edge pass. All right, you can see the first relatively shallow pass there. We've got about a 1/4 inch up and maybe 1/8 of an inch in. We're going to go ahead and take the full depth cut now. Now, there are special made rabbeting bits, but these are good for the kit they come in for making rabbets. If you want to put a back into a case or something like that and you just need a groove taken out. All right, there's the 1/4 inch slot bit used for a relatively shallow rabbet. We will now go and make an actual slot cut along the edge. Obviously, you can only go a certain depth with these for making rabbets, but like I said, they're pretty good for the back of like a casing. If you want to put a back on a bookcase or something like that, where you're just going to need a slight depth for 1/4 inch plywood, something like that. Okay, so the way we're going to slot cut here is we're going to move the fence forward to make sure we are just poking out from behind where the collet is. And that way we can move this up and take a slot out of the board without running into the collet. There are more specialty made slot cutting bits that have a little more rigidity and allow you to get a little more height on this so that you can go further out. It's just a different design, more cost. But if you really need a slot further in, you can look into those bits. And there's our edge slot cutting. Again, not very deep. I missed the center of the board by a little bit, but that's essentially what you're getting when you want to cut the slot. If you are up above where the collet would sit, you have to have the fence further forward. All right, now I'm going to set it up to do a slot on the face. And you're going to probably need a feather board for this, though you can do it without one if you have paddles to hold the piece of wood in. So the way we're going to cut this is we've got the feather board holding the bottom. I'm going to use my paddle to hold up above, and my hand is going to be above the router at all times. This is a lot easier on longer boards, but we'll be fine doing this. All right, there is our 1/4 inch slot cutting bit around the edge there. And then of course we've taken off the rabbet in this area, and you've got the slot on the face. You're probably asking yourself, why would you want a slot on the face? I don't know, but I figured I would show it since it is a function you can do. Normally it's going to be easier just to put a straight bit or a spiral bit in and run it across. But regardless, we're here, so we did it. There's your slots, and there is your rabbet. Quickly here, we're going to do the 1/2 inch slot cutting bit. Same basic premise, just taking a bigger chunk out. I'd slow your router bit down a speed for this one. It's got a lot of mass to it. We'll do the rabbet first, and then we'll do an edge slot. All right, the 1/2 inch slot cutting bit, pretty straightforward. There's our edge slot. And there's our 1/2 inch rabbet or rebate, depending upon which country you're from. Just like the 1/4 inch, it does a job, it does it well. You can't go too deep because of the diameter of the bit. You can only go up to the point where your collet is going to run into it. So you don't get that deep of a cut with the slot cutting bit that comes with a lot of these yellow Chinese-made router bit sets. As we get towards the end, with a few things left, I'll just touch quickly on the straight bits. These are simple and obvious. They cut a straight groove through. Most of these kits come with 1/4 inch, 3/8, and 1/2 inch. Now, be aware if you're using plywood and cutting grooves, oftentimes plywood is slightly undersized. Therefore, you're going to need to get plywood-specific router bits. These will fit okay. They just can be a little loose sometimes. The other problem with straight bits is that you can't really plunge them because there's no cutting head up top here. It's not sharp on the top, and it doesn't allow you to plunge in. So you need to drill a hole and then plunge through that, something that's the size, the diameter of the bit, and then go and continue your groove. However, I would highly suggest, if you find yourself using straight bits a lot, that you get a spiral bit. Now, I often use the upcut spiral, which leaves the bottom of the cut clean. The downcut spiral will leave the top cleaner, and they make combination spirals, I guess I'll call it, that go both ways. So it has an up and a down to, in theory, leave the bottom of the groove clean and the top of the groove clean. In these yellow bit kits, this is 3/8 of an inch of cutting height and both 1 inch cutting height on these two. As you can see, this is 1.5 inch. You can buy different bits of various cutting heights, meaning the space which you can actually use to cut and how deep that router bit can go down in there. So make sure for your project that the bit has a correct cutting height that you wish to use. And just be careful with these. As they dull, they tend to tear out much worse, and these spiral bits are really worth the upgrade. Next, we're going to go over the flush trim bit and the template/pattern routing bit, and why these are both great to have in a kit and what they're used for and what is the ideal situation. Let's start with the flush trim bit. Now on both of these, you'll notice there is a bearing, and that is riding on a surface that you want to use as a reference. This bit, in my opinion, is more ideal for going in a router table where the bearing is now facing up and the cutter head is coming out from the router table. If you use this in a handheld plunge router, it will obviously be upside down and your reference edge will be along the bottom. Let's say I've got this piece of wood and I want to transfer this pattern to it. Now, ideally, it's easier to watch what I'm doing if I've got the pattern on top. But of course, this bit will not allow us to do that. The pattern would need to be on the bottom and you would be flush trimming it along that way, which is much harder to see. Can be done, but it's easier when it's in a router table and you can go along and see what you're doing. Now, the templating bit offers a similar feature in that we have a bearing to ride along a reference surface, but from the other side. And you can get bits with bearings on both sides if you want to do it that way. But the thing I really like this bit for is plunging through a drilled out hole to trace an interior template pattern. By that, I mean I have used these router inserts numerous times to put circles in the middle of pieces of wood. You obviously have to drill a big hole in here to slide this through, but this then is able to trace around this from above so that I can see what I'm doing and so that I can still follow this internal pattern because there is nothing on the bottom here, meaning I can keep going. If I were to cut this much off, that's my new reference surface, and down and down and down. So both very useful bits with different purposes, though they can achieve similar results depending upon your setup and how you want to use the bearing. Both of these bits can also be useful to put a straight edge on a piece of wood with a handheld router. You would affix your straight edge either underneath or on top, and then choose your bit and ride along so that the bearing is on the straight edge and it removes an amount of material to match the straight edge, whether it's on the bottom with this one or on the top with this one. Now for the final bit, we're going to look at the dovetail bit. The obvious use of the dovetail bit is in dovetail jigs, in which you run your router either on the table or handheld to make machine dovetail. There are, however, other uses for the dovetail bit. I'm assuming that if you're buying a cheaper starter kit, you probably aren't buying a multi-$100 dovetail jig. And if you are, it's either going to come with the bit or you should buy a nicer bit. What I use the dovetail bit for is two things. One, it actually can be an interesting edge profile angle if you do it in reverse. It's a little more flexible than the 15-degree angle bit, which it's essentially that or very close to that. But because there's no bearing on it, you can play a little more with where you want that edge profile. But the main use I have for this bit is with sliding dovetail drawer slides. You use the dovetail bit to remove the material inside so that we have the slot to go into, and then we take the bit and we produce a drawer slide to go inside of there. It provides a really nice locking fit and is a great cheap way to make drawer slides. A long time ago, I built some drawers under my bench and I used dovetail slides to make these. They work incredibly well, and this is all just out of outdoor treated lumber, but it's cheap and they can be done very nicely with nicer hardwoods and can produce a really artisan fine look. So for the purposes of this video, I don't own a dovetail jig, so I'll just do a little quick showing of how to make these. At a later time, I'll make a more in-depth. I'm not going to go too in-depth with this. I'll just show the general process. Now, one other thing with a dovetail bit is that you have to take this cut all at once. You cannot creep your way up or else the bottom will be too wide. So for that, because this is removing a lot of material and can be a little hard on the bit and can dull the bit pretty fast due to heat, I often, though not always, will take a 1/4-inch router bit and remove some waste through the middle, and that really gives the dovetail bit an easier time making its way through and will prolong the life of that bit. So our first step for using this dovetail bit is going to be making the interior here, in which we will then match the slide to this. So we want to just remove, we'll say 1.5 of these to make it easier. I'm going to first remove the waste with a 1/4-inch bit here. You can use something a little larger depending upon how wide you want your dovetail slide. I like to do that just to make it easier on this bit, as it's a lot of material to remove at once. For a single router bit, it'll get hot, they'll dull quicker, it can be done. But remember, with this bit, you have to make this pass a single time at your full height, whatever your full height is. You cannot start low and then move up, 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 because the bottom will now be as wide as this is. So whatever your final height is, your one pass with this bit needs to be at that height. Now, of course, if we are making it wider, we can do multiple passes left and right. We just cannot do multiple passes vertical. So you are able to, once you make the pass at your full height, then simply shift your fence to do the other side to widen the dovetail. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to remove in a pass or two the 1/4-inch bit worth of waste down the middle. You don't need to remove a ton more. Just a 1/4 inch or so is fine. At this point, if you are doing only a single width, this is a little wider than a 1/4 inch, but if you want to keep your fence where it is, put a little piece of tape there. You've got a little room for error because this bottom is wider. So as long as you have only removed a 1/4 inch or so, you can realign it after moving the fence if you don't have an exact position you need to be set at. Now with your router unplugged, of course, you are going to line this up. You're going to match your bit height either to this or above, and you're going to simply aim for the middle, which is pretty easy to line up by using the little dot on the top of these bits. We're going to put that in there, and we are just going to make a pass straight through. Now this is a little hard on the router, so you're gonna get a little pushback, feedback, but it's not too bad. Just stick with it and you'll be fine. After you've made your first pass, if you wish for it to be wider, you then move the fence and take successive passes. Now that we've got our first pass, I'm just going to move the fence a little bit to make this a little wider so that when we go to make our slide, we get a little more meat on this. Okay, now that we've got our full width here, we'll just quickly lay out what we want our slide to be. And at a later time, I'll make a more in-depth video with the dimensions that I like to use for these for strength and some other tips on making these dovetail drawer slides. But this is just to show the bit for now. And that's going to do it for the 15-piece Amazon yellow, Chinese, Yonico, whatever company you buy from. Some of them are red. Router bit kit. As I said in the beginning, these are 10 out of 10 for me. I think these are a great way to get into router bits when you buy your first router. They're cheap, accessible, you get a wide variety, and when you're done with one of them, you've burnt it out, you've used it up, you can replace it with a nicer bit. You can also buy these individually from the same company for not a lot of cost, but I highly suggest buying a nicer version if you find yourself using a single bit or one or two of them a lot. Whiteside, Amana, other companies like that offer great bits. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching as always.